Hello, this video is for anyone studying a Gothic novel or the Gothic genre in general. Now, the focus of this video is going to be the convention or the theme of liminality. Now, this is quite high-level stuff, so this is mainly aimed at A-level students studying the Gothic genre, but if you're aiming for the very highest levels at GCSE, this video might interest you as well. The text that I'm going to focus on in particular in this video I've generally split into 4 different categories here. The earliest novels from the pre-Victorian period are The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And these are generally considered, along with Anne Radcliffe, among the very first Gothic writers or writers in the Gothic convention. Moving into the middle of the Victorian period, we have Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Moving to the very end of the 19th century and the end of the Victorian period, we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Even though when you read Dracula it does feel much more traditional, it is actually part of this later Victorian period, or the late 19th century. Finally, I'm also going to touch on Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. This was published in 1977, and if you're studying this, you know it's a rewrite, a subversion of both the Gothic genre and the fairy tale genre as well. First things first, what does liminality actually mean? Liminality is a significant convention of the Gothic genre, but it's important that we understand what it means so that we can use it in our exams and essays. It comes originally from the Latin word meaning threshold. So it's all about places that are boundaries or in-between spaces. So a liminal space is usually a boundary or a crossover point between two extremes. It's a place of transition, transgression, and change, basically. So let's firstly turn to Gothic settings, the places where Gothic writers have chosen to set their narratives. And the first and most obvious one, of course, is the castle. Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe, all of these writers chose for most of their action to take place in a castle, and the castle is very important. It's supposed to elicit very strong emotions, particularly fear and intrigue. Castles are often places of mystery and sometimes places of decay. They're very old. Lots of things have happened there, and this all adds to the sense of mystery. In addition, a lot of these Gothic castles are surrounded by harsh and forbidding landscapes. So Harker describes the mountains as guards when he approaches Count Dracula's castle. In Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber, she chooses for the Marquis's castle to be surrounded by the sea. It's a tidal castle, and it can only be approached twice a day when the tide is out. And this gives a real sense of isolation and a sense that the Marquis's evil can take place without anybody on the mainland knowing, and without the female protagonist having any access to help. And this all adds to the sense of terror. Remember also that castles are exotic. They are places that the ordinary reader, especially the ordinary Victorian reader, might not have ever seen. And so it was this place apart from the real world. It was a fantasy world where fantastical and strange and supernatural things could happen. Not all Gothic writers, of course, choose to set their Gothic stories in a castle. Emily Bronte, for example, chose a pair of humble houses in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors to set her novel Wuthering Heights. These were still liminal spaces, though. These were still places where transgressions could happen and where the two families could separate themselves from the conventions of the codified Victorian society. Both families behave in unusual ways and treat one another in unusual ways. And there's still unusual relationships developed and unusual dynamics developed within these families. And Heathcliff in particular is a very liminal character because he neither belongs with his adopted family nor anywhere else either. And that manifests itself in his behaviour throughout the novel. And it's all set in this backdrop of a liminal setting where anything could happen, and it's still a place of fantasy and transgressions. Towards the end of the 19th century and the end of the Victorian era, There was a trend away from setting Gothic stories in castles and on moors, and instead there was a trend towards setting these narratives in the city of London. And this was a conscious choice by writers like Oscar Wilde and Robert Louis Stevenson. They wanted a sense of reality, and they wanted to slap their readers in the face with the idea that these strange goings-on could be happening right under their noses in their neighbours' houses. However, in a city where there are millions of people and seemingly no privacy, there are still these liminal spaces. There are still these spaces where transformations and transgressions are possible. In the picture of Dorian Gray, for example, almost all of the action takes place behind closed doors. And we get almost a sense of an underground community being described. And this is probably partly to do with Oscar Wilde's life. Oscar Wilde spent most of his time in London houses, in private houses, having private conversations with people. And here we have Dorian Gray migrating around London and around the aristocratic houses of London and slowly descending into his immoral lifestyle. In this section, we get a description of Dorian Gray visiting an opium house in Soho, and Soho becomes this place in Gothic literature of liminality, of the possibility of transformation, of transgressing who you're supposed to be, of subverting those Victorian codes. Here, Dorian Gray is going to visit an opium den where one could buy oblivion. Dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. So we get this sense of Soho and the opium dens in particular as liminal spaces where Dorian Gray could transgress the boundary between good and evil, the boundary between sin and virtue. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson used Soho in a very similar way to Oscar Wilde. It was this place of narrow streets, of darkness, of mysterious doorways, of mysterious things behind those doorways where anything could happen. And in fact, Dr. Jekyll visits Soho in the guise of Mr. Hyde in order to explore his darker fantasies and his darker desires. In the Carew murder case, after we've seen the brutal murder of Sir Danvers Carew, Utterson visits and describes Soho as this, a dismal quarter of Soho seen under these changing glimpses. So this pre-modifier here, changing, is really establishing the sense of liminality here. Soho is a place of change. It's a place where good becomes evil. With its muddy ways and slatternly passengers, this idea that people are passengers on Soho's journey to become a place of iniquity, and its lamps, which had never been extinguished or had been kindled afresh to combat this mournful reinvasion of darkness, seemed in the lawyer's eyes like a district of some city in a nightmare. Within these liminal Gothic settings, there are often liminal aspects to those settings, and by this I mean in particular subterranean passageways, windows and doors. So within these settings and within these buildings, there are these specific places where transition happens, or there are specific boundary places, and they're normally windows, doors and passageways. Places that are physically underground and provide this dark, secret place where transgressive behaviour can happen, or where secrets can be kept, have been very important in Gothic literature from the start. And in the Castle of Otranto, much of the action happens in these underground passageways underneath the castle. And here we have Raylo describing to us the silence that fills these subterranean passageways, and the terror that accompanies that silence when the silence is broken by the sound of door hinges moving. In Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber, the underground vaults play a key role in the development of the narrative and the development of the character. The unnamed protagonist is tempted down into these underground vaults by her husband, who hints at the darkness and depravity that lies below. She is given a key but told not to use it, and this key plays a key role in tormenting her until she finally gives in to her curiosity. So eventually she descends into this abyss of dark and finds her husband's instruments of mutilation and the dead bodies of his former wives. What have all of these subterranean passageways and underground vaults got to do with liminality then? Well, on a very simple level, of course, these are places in darkness, they are hidden from the above ground world, therefore, depraved and subversive activities can take place in secrecy. Often, though, these are places where female protagonists explore, and often female protagonists in Gothic novels start as very innocent and end the novel having made the journey through maturity into a place of worldliness and knowledge as opposed to their original naivety and innocence. And for me, that's why these underground spaces are normally in the Gothic genre places of liminality. One example of liminality in Gothic buildings that might be a little bit easier for you to get your head around is the idea of a doorway. Doorways, of course, are liminal because they are boundaries from the outside to the inside or from one room to another within a house. So they are places of stepping from one place to another place physically, but often symbolically as well. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Robert Louis Stevenson, for example, dedicates an entire chapter to describing Mr. Hyde's door. It's described on a vibrant and pretty street in Soho, and it's in stark contrast to its surroundings. It's stained and blistered, and it has no knocker, which implies, obviously, that nobody is supposed to be visiting, and that only the person who lives there is able to see what's behind the door. Of course, we know that Mr. Hyde symbolises everything that's depraved and decaying about society, and Stevenson used the door to symbolise that. He also used it, of course, to convey Jekyll's transformation from Dr. Jekyll, the respectable Victorian gentleman, to the dirtier and more depraved Mr. Hyde. It's important, of course, that this doorway can, through a secret passageway, lead to Dr. Jekyll's house in Cavendish Square. In a similar vein to the liminal space of a doorway, we often have the liminality of a window incorporated into Gothic novels as well. Again, Robert Louis Stevenson used this to symbolise Dr. Jekyll's descent into depravity and his inability to cope with his good and his evil sides and his inability to reconcile them. At this point, quite late in the novel, we have Utterson visit Dr. Jekyll, and he's only able to speak to him from outside in the courtyard, with Dr. Jekyll described as imprisoned inside his home. He looks out of the window, and Utterson just gets a small glimpse into the torment of his friend. In this case, of course, the window is used as a liminal space because it is a boundary that is only semi-transparent. You can only see through a window, you can only see a small part of the room and a small part of the inhabitants of the house through a window. And equally, you can only see a small part of the world from inside out of your window. It is, in this case as well, a place of transformation. At this point, this is where Utterson and Jekyll's friendship reaches quite a low point. Utterson, I think, loses all hope in saving Jekyll at this point because he sees the abject terror in Jekyll's face from the window. And this is, of course, the last time Utterson sees Jekyll alive. Finally, I'd like to explore the way that liminality could be conveyed through the human body in the Gothic genre. And this might sound a little bit confusing, but if liminality is all about a place of boundaries or two sides grappling with one another or a place of transition or transformation, actually the human body often represents those things. And the first and most obvious place where we see this, of course, is in Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Jekyll's body is a place of duality, his mind is a place of duality, and he uses science to try and reconcile that duality, to try and reconcile his good and his evil sides. He tries to separate his good and his evil sides through science and through transforming his body. So, in a very obvious way in Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll's body becomes a liminal space. In the picture of Dorian Gray, also, Dorian's body becomes a place of liminality, where he, Basil, and Henry explore the duality of virtue and sin through Dorian's beauty. While he descends into moral depravity, And while he experiences moral decay throughout the novel, Dorian's body shows none of that decay on a physical level. So actually we see this throughout the novel of Dorian Gray. We see this idea of exploring the possibilities of transgressing society without it being shown physically. And for me, that's why Dorian's body is also a liminal space. Frankenstein's monster is, of course, a liminal body. He is neither human nor supernatural. He is neither alive nor dead, and thus he exists between these two states, making him a liminal character and making his body a liminal space. Angela Carter, of course, explores the theme of liminality through the physical bodies of her characters in the Bloody Chamber. In The Tiger's Bride, for example, we have the female protagonist freeing herself of society's constraints by becoming the beast herself at the end of the novel. And we have this beautiful description of her shedding her skin and freeing her beautiful fur. And thus her body becomes this liminal space where she is transformed and metamorphosed into a beast that would not be accepted by society, but that is accepted by her and her lover. In The Company of Wolves, of course, we have the hunter who is secretly a werewolf, and the werewolf is nothing new. The ability of a man to transform into a beast is nothing new in the Gothic genre. And this use of the male body as a place of transformation into the possibility of a beast is nothing new in the Gothic genre. And finally, of course, we have Wolf Alice, where she has a dysmorphic view of her own body. And the story of Wolf Alice is a story of her exploration of herself and her own identity through her ability to see that she is not, in fact, a wolf. All of these examples show that Angela Carter is very aware of the human body as a potential place for liminal experiences and liminal symbolism.